Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and we're in Lesson 2 for this chapter. And we're going to talk about the Jim Crow laws today and some discrimination in the end of Reconstruction in the United States. And so this first slide, kind of picking up where we left off in the last chapter, not the last lesson, but the last chapter. The slaves are free. We know that the slaves are free. And the freedmen is what the freed slaves are called freedmen. The freedmen, they relish, they're so happy about their new status as freed people. And there is slow progress forward to get rights for African Americans, but it's very, very slow. But it's still progress. Some freedmen become sharecroppers and they farm. Others, they move on or they try to find any work that they can find. And some don't find, many don't find work actually. And so the whites in the South are instituting something called black codes. They're codes or laws specifically for black people so that they can prevent black people from voting, from going to school, from whatever white people don't want them to do. They put laws in place. And often they're violent. They will kill African Americans if the African American does something a little bit wrong. And we'll talk more about that in future chapters. And so black codes, if we look at the next slide, you can see the examples of black codes are, it defines what a person of color means. And this is state to state. So each state can have Mississippi and Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia and South Carolina. All of them can have their own different black codes, but every state had them. So one of the things that they did, and these ones that we're looking at here from Mississippi, defined person of color. What is a black person actually? What does it mean? It prevented blacks from voting, from holding office, and from serving on juries. It said blacks cannot serve on a jury. And a jury is something that you're going to study more about in government class, but I urge you to look that up on the internet now and understand what a jury does. It required that poor, unemployed persons, but only if they're black, they be arrested and sent to jail. And then once they're in jail, they can be sent out to some place and the person can pay the state for them to work, but the person doesn't get any money. And so if they have a year of jail sentence, well, they can be made to go out and work for 1 year, and they get no money from that. Well, basically that means that they are a slave again, and that was legal in the South. And so this was not a good thing. And so look at the next slide, if you can see the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and 68. Now we did talk about some of these, so I just want to very briefly mention them again. Reconstruction is the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. Now that means not just rebuilding buildings, but rebuilding the government, because the South had completely said that they were no longer part of the United States. And so we can't take the leaders of the southern states and that were before the Civil War and that fought against the United States and put them back into the same positions. And so initially, one of the solutions was to make the southern states, and you can see these that are shaded in different colors, orange, green, pink, purple, and blue. And these were the Confederate states. And these Confederate states were given military governors, which meant that a military general would come down and decide what was going to happen. So they were basically under martial law for a couple of years. Now, they didn't like that, as you can imagine. They hated it. They hated it. So, and the North didn't like to deal with it either. And so this begins shortly after the Civil War. We also begin to see whites be violent towards blacks. And you can see on this next slide, it says violence. The Ku Klux Klan, and that's what you see a picture of here. You see a bunch of men dressed in white robes and white hoods, and they've got a burning cross. And they fought against rights for African Americans. There were organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, the Southern Cross, the Knights of the White Camellia, and then Confederate soldiers, or CSA, Confederate States of America soldiers, roamed, particularly in Missouri. They roamed around and they kind of engaged in guerrilla warfare against African Americans and against American troops. And a few high-level government and military officials in the South publicly supported the Ku Klux Klan, which was racist and trying to be violent against Black African Americans. They burned houses down. They lynched African Americans. And they continued to do this really up through the mid to late 1870s. But I want to look at a couple of elections here. The election of 1868, and that's on your next slide. Grant wins, but that's not really what I want to talk about here. What I want to point out to you is that you can see blue in the north and the south, and you can see red in the north and in the south. Now you do see a few gray states. Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas are gray. Now that means that they've not yet been reaccepted into the United States after the war. They're forced to rejoin, but they've not been reaccepted yet. They've not met the conditions. And so in this first election after the Civil War, we've got blue Democrats in the north and south, and we've got red Republicans also in the north and the south. And so that's a good thing, because that means that we're seeing African American participation, and we're no longer sectional. We're no longer just north is blue or red, north is red and blue in the south. So we don't want to see that. In the next election of 1872, we see the same thing. Now we see that Texas and Virginia are back. But we still see blue and red in the north and the south, both places. So we've got blue in Maryland, and we've got blue as far south as Georgia and Texas, and we've got red in Maine in the very top corner, and we've got red in Florida in the very bottom corner on the right. So that's a good thing too. Now, election of 1876, look at your next slide. We're going to look at what happens, because in the election of 1876, this is when Reconstruction fails. So it becomes difficult because people in the North, it's 1876. The war ended in 1865. It ended 11 years ago. And people in the northern states are tired of dealing with what they call the Negro question, the slave question, the black question. They're just tired of dealing with it. They don't want to deal with it anymore. And they're tired of having to force people in the South to not be racist. And in 1876, the economy is bad. And they're just tired of the Southern question. The economy they need to focus on the economy more. And Grant's considered, Ulysses S. Grant, he was a good general, but he is considered today one of the worst American presidents in history, in our history. And so this election, 1876, is Tilden against Hayes. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president, but there are 3 states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. And I want you to look at the next slide here, and you can see that those 3 states, Louisiana, right to the right of Texas, and then further right is Florida. It's hanging down there by itself. It's red. And then just up a little bit is South Carolina. It's also red. Those 3 states are red. And Democrats, which are blue, accused Republicans of cheating. And Republicans accused Democrats of cheating. And so Rutherford B. Hayes said that to Tilden's people, Rutherford B. Hayes says, I'll tell you what, we'll remove the military presence, we'll take away all the soldiers from the South, and we'll end Reconstruction efforts. We'll leave you alone if you let us have the White House. And so what happens? Hayes gets the White House, Republicans win, and that's the end of Reconstruction, because Republicans say, you know what? We're finished. We fought the war. We tried to get equal rights for African Americans, and it didn't work, and now we're finished. So what happens next? Look at the next slide. That's my question. I want you to watch what happens now. Over the next 3 or 4 slides, we're going to see those election maps again. And I want you to watch what happens. Okay? I'm going to go through them quickly, but I'm going to talk about each one very quickly. Okay? 1868 election. Again, we see blue and red in the north and the south. 1872 election. We still see red and blue in the north and the south. 1876 election. We see a lot of blue this time, but we see red and blue still in the north and the south. Now look at the 1880 election. What do we see? We see only blue in the south and only red in the north. after the election of 1876, when the United States government decided that they would leave the South alone, at this moment, the South knew that they had won. They knew that they could stop blacks from voting. They knew that they could stop blacks from becoming government officials. They could keep blacks out completely. And so that's the way it was. From 1880, almost for 100 years until about 1964, which is not quite 100 years, about 84 years, 86 years. And so quite a long time, the South stays blue. 1 or 2 elections different when Wilson runs for president and when Roosevelt runs for president. The South kind of all goes to one party. In those cases, both Democrats. And the North goes to all one party as well. So, and this is the end of Reconstruction, and it's a failure, which means that for the next almost 100 years, African Americans have to suffer, and the United States government doesn't do much to help them. So that's the end of Reconstruction, and that's the end of this lesson. And so we'll see you guys next time. We start talking about, in the next couple of chapters, we're going to talk about big businesses, and these guys got really, really rich. So, all right, we'll talk to you guys then. Bye-bye.